Here it is. All right.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We were fully aware when setting this event up that it is not the best time of the year. Unfortunately, the people who did what they did in Mumbai 10 years ago did not recognize the Thanksgiving break in the US. So this is the anniversary, and we thought about it, and we decided we should do it, given that it's 10 years hence. Thank you for joining us. My name is Moeed Yusuf. I am the Associate Vice President here of the Asia program at USIP. And our Asia program, our two largest programs are Afghanistan, Pakistan, and we do a lot of work on regional issues, including India and Pakistan. Personally, I've just written a book on India-Pakistan crises since '98 when they tested nuclear weapons. So this is a topic very close to my heart as well. And one of the main sort of case studies that I look at is this Mumbai crisis. Today, though, my job is to strictly shut up and let our August panel speak. These are people who've actually worked on this issue for a long time, both in governments and outside. And what we're hoping to do is not to relitigate what happened 10 years ago. This conversation is really about where to go from here. What are the lessons that India and Pakistan seem to have learned since the Mumbai attacks 10 years ago? Are they better prepared today to deal with terrorism and other potential crisis triggers? I mean, we talk about terrorism all the time, and that's sort of what has, triggered crises in the past. But what about other possible avenues? What about Kashmir and the line of control? I mean, the violence levels there have been the highest in 15 years last year. And one of our speakers, who I will just introduce, is an expert specifically on the LOC and the violations of the ceasefire there. What about crisis management? What if we do get into a crisis next time? Are India and Pakistan prepared? How are they going to manage it? And then I think a broader question is the state of terrorism in the region. Where do we see it going? And again, we have experts who've written books on this, and so you really could not have a better panel to have this conversation. Let me introduce the speakers. We'll begin with Dr. Happymon Jacob, who you see on the screen, in New Delhi, which means that it is probably, close to 1 o'clock in Delhi. Thankfully, he's a night owl, so he was awake. When I asked him, he agreed, or I had to force him, actually. But anyways, our agreement with him is he will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes, take any questions you have, and then go to bed. And then we'll go from there. And after that, we will have Ambassador Riaz Khan, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, spent about 40 years in the Pakistani Foreign Service, was the Foreign Secretary from 2005 to 8, if I'm not wrong. And also was a Woodrow Wilson Scholar in 2009, and has written one of the best books that I've read on Afghanistan and sort of the First War and the Soviet withdrawal and events around that. We will then move to Shumaila Chaudhry. Again, very good friend, somebody I've known and respected for a number of years, is currently at SAIS, working as the senior advisor to the dean at SAIS. Before that, a director of Pakistan and Afghanistan at the National Security Council at the White House. And at the time of Mumbai, I believe you were at the State Department in the policy planning world. So again, somebody who's seen this from very close quarters, and will talk about the US angle of crisis management and the topic. And then last but not least, again, my good friend Steve Tankel, who's an associate professor at American University, has worked at the Department of Defense, is an author, and if you haven't read his books, I strongly urge you to buy those and get your hands on them, after you buy mine, of course. No. But he's written a book on the LET, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the group that was responsible for the Mumbai attacks, and very recently written a book on US partnerships in counterterrorism and how they help and hinder the war on terror. And that's literally fresh off the press. So with that, let me see if Happymon, you want to go first and give us a sense of the questions from India, and then we'll move from there.
it's, as Mohit pointed out, almost 12:45. So if I don't make so much sense, you can blame it on the fact that it is way past my bedtime here. But it's good to see you, Mohit, and good to see Ambassador Khan, Shamila, and Stephen. Thank you for having me. It's always wonderful talking about India-Pakistan relations. Although things seem to be in a sort of semi-permanent freeze in the bilateral sort of partnership here. The decision to open the Kartarpur Sahib corridor, I must say, has sort of come as a very encouraging sign that things are probably not going all that south, that things might pick up in the days to come. Because there was a scare, there was a worry that given the fact that we have the elections coming up early mid next year, and that things have been not looking very good, things might not be all that fantastic between the two sides. But I think that we have something that is very encouraging in the form of the opening of the Kartarpur Sahib corridor. But I want to sort of begin by talking about why 26/11 or the Mumbai terror attacks is sort of important for the Indians. It has become sort of a rallying cry in India against sort of terrorism. And unfortunately, we have been unable to shake off the memories of 26/11 and the vivid images streamed into our drawing rooms from Mumbai 10 years ago. And it's sort of etched deep down in our psyche for good or bad. I think that's a reality. So I think there's a lack of closure that still haunts the Indian psyche in many ways. One, because there is a feeling in India that the trials have not really gone anywhere as far as the perpetrators are concerned. And secondly, there is also the argument that the perpetrators continue to roam free in Pakistan. But be that as it may, you go to any track to, the Indians will continue to press this point home that, hey, 26/11, what about that? So it's something that you can't really get over. And we have the election season in India, and one particular political party makes it a point to talk about 26/11 and Mumbai and Uri and Pathankot and Pakistan every now and then. This is also something that unfortunately can't be shaken off. So there is a lingering feeling in India, and that's an unfortunate feeling, that we didn't do anything 10 years ago to avenge the death of our citizens in Mumbai. And unfortunately, this has come to sort of define India's understanding or image of contemporary Pakistan as it were. Hence, it cannot be wished away. So I thought I'd sort of try and tell you this political context within which we in India, or the majority in India, seem to perceive Mumbai and what happened 10 years ago. To the specific question that you sort of asked, Mohit, what lessons India and Pakistan have learned from the Mumbai experience? I think what comes to my mind very readily is that there is a certain feeling in India that there are very, very few kinetic options in India vis-a-vis Pakistan on the question of terrorism. Of course, there is this talk about surgical strikes and the rest, but I'll sort of come to that in a minute. But I think the feeling is pretty strong because of the nuclear overhand. Many people have talked about it, including Mr. Menon in his book, the then National Security Advisor, in fact, the then Deputy National Security Advisor. So, but the point is that the kinetic options are very limited. I think the Indian sort of learning is clearly that. And on the Pakistani side, I think seeing it from the Indian point of view, I think that the Pakistanis may have realized that it is important to keep a tight leash on some of these non-state actors operating out of Pakistan. I think the realization that these actors can probably escalate the situation out of control is a good sort of lesson learned, as it were. But I think what one gets to hear repeatedly in Delhi, in the strategic circles here, is that should there be a 26/11, a repeat of 26/11, there is likely to be some kind of a response. Now, 26/11 was the point is that the politicians have talked about it so much that if something, God forbid, something happens of that kind, there is no way that they can get away from that. They will have to do something about it. It's sort of a promise that you keep repeating, that at the end of the day you'll fall victim to that. So even though one might therefore doubt the utility, military utility of the 2016 surgical strikes, it somehow, in my mind, reflects the underlying desire of the Indian state to respond to subconventional aggression from the Pakistani side. So in that sense, the surgical strikes are seen as one way of, it's a low-cost response to the Pakistani side. But I must also say, I think there is a lot more sensitivity on the Pakistani side, the way I see it, and I keep meeting Pakistani colleagues in various tractive forums about India's red lines, and they seem to appreciate these red lines in many ways. So that's probably why that you see that things have sort of not gone over the board since the Mumbai attacks, as it were. So if you ask me if they have learned any mutual lessons, I would say probably not, because they have not been really talking to each other in a very useful manner, as it were. But to the second question, are India and Pakistan better prepared today to deal with terrorism jointly or separately? Well, I mean, looking at it from 2018, November 2018, I must say that's a very far-fetched sort of an idea. But it is not without a precedent. Let's sort of look back at the India-Pakistan relations in 2006. A momentum was created under Abbas Khani is here. The India-Pakistan joint anti-terrorism mechanism. And this was picking up in 2006 and 2007, when unfortunately, after the Mumbai attacks, it sort of died a very natural death. And there has been some discussion in 2016 during the talks between the Indian National Security Advisor Ajit Kumar Doval and the then Pakistani NSA General Janjua. The reviving of this mechanism was reportedly discussed, but it didn't really get anywhere. We had recently the SCO joint anti-terror sort of drill that was conducted. It was much commented upon, but of course it was brought by that, it was more multilateral in nature. But at least that's some sort of a beginning of something, as it were. Again, in 2000, going back to 2016, there was some basic intel that was given to the Indian side of infiltration from the Pakistani side. In fact, the Pakistani NSA called up the Indian NSA and gave this intel. But I may sort of, if I may underline what to my mind is even more important, is what happened after the Pathankot attack. And that was after the airbase attack in Pathankot. The Indian side invited the Pakistani investigation team to come to a critical, sensitive airbase in Punjab and take a look at for themselves as to how the attack may have taken place. Unfortunately, the return invitation for the National Investigation Team of India to visit Islamabad and to continue that process, that invitation never came. And unfortunately, that somehow stalled the entire process, and there's no talk of any sort of joint mechanism to deal with terror in the subcontinent. It sort of died down there. So there is very little, at this point of time, as you realize, there's very little appetite for any joint approach for countering terrorism. The other question that you asked, Moid, is about, again, is crisis management easier or tougher today than a decade ago? I must say that the crisis management today is probably tougher than pre-2008, though it is probably not tougher than, say, pre-2003. Things used to be much worse before 2003, when we had the ceasefire agreement in the November of 2003. But the reason why I say that the crisis management today is tougher because of three reasons. One, because we do not have any bilateral mechanism for crisis management. We used to have the NSA level talks happening. Janjua and Doval used to meet in Bangkok. They used to call up each other. They used to share their thoughts on various issues with each other. That consultation somehow does not take place anymore because Pakistan does not have an NSA. So probably it's a good idea to designate a person who probably can be in conversation with Mr. Doval in Delhi. Second reason why I think the crisis management is tougher today is because there is no back channel between India and Pakistan at this point of time. And we used to have a back channel between the two sides before 2014, Mr. Lamba and his counterpart in Pakistan. And they did a lot of work even after the Mumbai terror attack. So I must say that the back channel, because they had the year of their principles in Islamabad and in New Delhi, they did a lot of work behind the screens, and that's really not happening today. And I think the reluctance for that is in many ways coming from New Delhi. The Modi government is not keen on having seen as engaged in a sort of conversation, sustained conversation in the back channel with Pakistan for clearly political reasons. And third reason why I think crisis management is tougher today is because as Mohit, you sort of, I'm reading this very interesting book by Mohit, as you sort of point out in your book, the United States played a very important role in the bilateral crisis management in the past. The question that I think we must ask today, and we do ask that in Delhi, is whether the Trump administration is in a mood to play that role. And even if the Trump administration is in a mood to play that role, is Pakistan, is Islamabad and Rawalpindi going to listen to Washington DC on that? Or is it going to be China that is going to sort of play a mediator's role? And if so, is New Delhi going to listen to China? So I think we have a very tricky sort of a geopolitical situation today, and unlike say 01, 02 back in 2001, 2002, and in 2008, we have a very different sort of global geopolitical situation. So we don't know who is going to play the role of the honest broker. But more importantly, is there any crisis de-escalation mechanism that exists today between India and Pakistan? And I sincerely doubt if there is any, given the upcoming elections that we have in India and the continuous ceasefire violations that we have on the line of control, and the overzealous media, especially on the Indian side, covering what happens on the line of control with great enthusiasm and often with a lot of hyperbole. Things could really go south. But unfortunately, we don't have any mechanisms to sort of take care of that. We do talk about the surgical strikes as having been something, at least on the Indian side, as surgical strikes were something really spectacular, and that we did respond to the Uri humiliation attack. The reality is that surgical strikes were done by both India and Pakistan even before 2008. And I've studied the phenomenon of ceasefire violations to a great extent, and I can say with some certainty that this has always been the life on the line of control. But what is different today is that it's a lot more escalatory today than it was ever before, thanks to the media and thanks to the election cycles and hyper-nationalist governments. So the other thing that one must also say about the line of control and ceasefire violations is that and depending on how you look at it, it's either positive or negative. Since the two sides, because of the nuclear overhang, cannot go to war in a sort of very overt manner, much of the violence and the frustration and the desire for retaliation shifts to the line of control. So you will see a lot more ceasefire violations. You see a lot more surgical strikes. You see a lot more tactical capture of land, etc., on the line of control, because it can't be done elsewhere. It's simply impossible to do that. Now, it may be convenient, but it is very dangerous. You may think, hey, what happens in the line of control remains there, but in reality, it doesn't, not anymore. So you may, while it may be convenient to shift the heat to the line of control, to my mind, it's extremely dangerous. So I think there are several things that need to be done clearly, and that is one is the NSA contacts have to be revived. The Pakistani side has been, and rightly so, asking for the formalization of the ceasefire agreement of 2003, November 2003. I think that is very important. In fact, a telephone conversation is not enough to maintain sanity and peace along this very dangerous stretch of border that India and Pakistan share. And thirdly, I must also say that it is important to revive the back channel between the two sides as a crisis management, as a de-escalation mechanism, as it were. But I must say that I must end this by saying, Mohit, that what Mumbai did was not just to rupture the relationship between India and Pakistan, but really undo what was achieved between, say, 2004 and 2008. Ambassador Khan would remember that we were so close to achieving, going by what the principals and others have said on this matter, a formula on Kashmir, and all that was undone in one spectacular attack. And of course, on the following up the Kabul embassy attack against the Indian embassy there. But I think that is the unfortunate part. It is undone what we achieved. So I think with that I will stop, Mohit, and I'll stay on for some more time. Should you have any questions or comments on this? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Hapiman. That was great, comprehensive. I will not let the others go that long because they're next to me. But no, this was fantastic. Let me also, I forgot to mention, Hapiman has talked a lot about the ceasefire violations and the line of control. He actually runs a website called the Indo-Pak Conflict Monitor, and all of you should actually see that if you have time. It's got some fantastic data on the line of control and India-Pakistan conflict and the dynamics around that. And of course, he's a professor at JNU in Delhi as well. So let me see.
Mohit, I could stay back should you wish me to, for the other presenters to finish their presentations and then take the first few set of questions. And
this would be another 45 minutes, and I really don't want to do that to you.
Then I'll take the question.
Yeah, so let me just ask if anybody has a question for you now. And if not, we will thank you again and let you go. Does anybody have any questions for Hapiman? Okay, let me ask you one question, Hapiman, before you leave. And this is something that I've grappled with a lot for my book, but otherwise as well for my other work. And you can imagine I get this question very regularly. I was just writing an op-ed sort of thing on this topic in the last couple of days. And again, this question came up, and every time I speak to Indian colleagues and interlocutors, especially government, there is a default ironclad conviction that any terrorism that is linked to a group that's based in Pakistan is happening with the understanding, if not approval, of the Pakistani state. So sort of the default position is that all of this is still very much engineered. On the Pakistani side, I think there's one view that says this is all nonsense. The more nuanced view is, yes, these groups have not been tamed. They are there. They are active. But this is not the time of the 90s or the early 2000s. And the proxy issue is much more complicated. And I have sort of dug into this as much as I can. And the more I do, the more complicated it becomes. Because it's very difficult to define the causality here. So I'm going to ask this to others as well, but since you're here, what is your sense from the Indian side of this view, essentially?
No, I think that's a fair question, Mohit. Most Indians tend to look at, of course, Pakistan in a very unnuanced manner. We have a very sort of black and white understanding of Pakistan, and that Pakistani state has a certain revisionist agenda, and they have been up to things in Kashmir. They have been doing things vis-a-vis India for the last several decades, and all of which are, of course, not untrue clearly. We often hear of the Pakistani officials and others telling us that, hey, up to your point, we were doing things in Kashmir, but not anymore, clearly. But be that as it may, but I think the reality is that often we fail to understand that the Pakistani state's capacity in managing terrorism, in managing terrorist groups, in managing terrorists is limited. Now that I'm not therefore suggesting that the ISI or the deep state or sections within the ISI have nothing to do with what happens in Kashmir. And I firmly believe, and I'm a regular visitor to Kashmir, that much of what is happening in Kashmir, for instance, is domestically, it has domestic roots, it is indigenous in nature, and yet you have infiltrations going up from 2014 onwards. So you have a domestic insurgency in Kashmir. You do have local boys joining militancy, and there is a lot of hopelessness in Kashmir. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And yet you do have weapons from across the border. You do have money coming from across the border. You do have infiltration coming from across the border. So I think it's a combination of things. You have a political conflict in Kashmir. You have an outstanding issue between the two sides, and that sort of compounds what happens between the two sides. So, but to go back to what I said earlier, and that is to say, I am not one of those who believe that everything is engineered by Pakistani leaders have been attacked. If Pakistani military installations have been attacked in the past by terrorists, there's nothing that tells me that they won't attack the Indians. Clearly they would, but there are elements, there are elite, there is the elite, and there are the Hizbul Mujahideen, there are the others who have had in the past links with the Pakistani deep state. So there are terrorists and there are terrorists, but not all of them are sort of put up by the Pakistani state. So I think it's a complicated sort of story, and to simplify that would be doing no justice to the story.
Thank you. Abhiman, once again, thank you very much. This is way beyond the call of duty. I want to thank you for joining. Oh, you have a question? Sorry, we have one question for you.
Sure.
So yeah, my question is the Kartarpur initiative. The Kartarpur initiative, how do the people, or generally in India, how are people looking at it as?
The Kartarpur initiative, the corridor, what is the reaction in India?
You know, it's complicated because within Punjab, there isn't too much of a groundswell of support for the Kartarpur Sahib corridor, as it were. It's more a CBM rather than about the Sikhs going to the other side and visiting the Kartarpur Sahib Gurudwara there. Because I mean, as you realize, the older Sikhs are probably more passionate about it. But the strength of the organized Sikhism and religion within Punjab is not really as strong as it used to be earlier. So the desire for going to Pakistan, going to the Gurudwara is not as sort of enthusiastic it is made out to be. That does not take away from the fact that this is an absolutely fantastic confidence building measure, and I hope that this goes a long way in sort of sustaining the thought that we have found, and as a sort of mechanism to contain any negativity that we've sort of witnessed in the last several months, especially after the 21st of September, when the Indian government said that we will not have the foreign ministers meeting in New York.
Got you. Thank you very much again. Thanks for joining us. Thanks.
All right, so, Lashkar, please.
Thank you, Moeed. First, we all remember with sadness the precious lives lost this week 10 years ago in Mumbai. In my sort of comments, I'll basically talk about the larger context of terrorism, the groups, extremist groups, violent militant groups linked to Pakistan, and thirdly, the question that you have raised about the possibility of India-Pakistan cooperation. Now, first and obviously, there is no consensus view of terrorism. Much of what is viewed as terrorism depends on political perspectives, circumstances, and history of a region. I often prefer to call it extremist violence by non-state actors. Second, Palestine and the Afghan jihad, in my view, have been the two mainsprings of radical militant Islam in the recent decades. During the 1980s, Afghanistan attracted radical elements from all across the Islamic world. They enjoyed international backing. In 1990s, many of these extremist elements participated in struggles in Bosnia, in Chechnya, and spread as far as North and West Africa. Al-Qaeda, of course, emerged as a reaction to US presence, a military presence in Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War. Third, in my view, the wave of religious militancy and Islamic extremism has peaked. Two reasons. Muslim countries affected by this militancy have suffered the most, and rejection is coming from within those countries. Secondly, the three models of radical Islamic governance, Chechnya under Dudayev, Afghanistan under the Taliban, and the ISIS in Syria and Iraq, they were utter failures. Also, most of the advanced countries have now developed vast counterterrorism capacities. This does not mean that fundamentalism in Islamic society is on the decline. This phenomena is in fact buttressed by the rise of the religious right in the West, and it carries the potential for breeding extremism. Now, a brief comment on militant groups in Pakistan. A lot is known about these groups, and they have various religious, political, and ethnic disposition. In specific terms, I would look at them briefly in two broad categories: those who carry out acts of violence within the country and those who operate outside Pakistan. Generally speaking, I'll place sectarian extremist groups, ethnic militant groups, and Tehreek-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, in the first category, and the Afghan Taliban and Kashmir-related groups in the second category. Sectarian tensions, as you know, in the Pakistan society have always been there. They were intensified by the Saudi-Iran rivalry and turned violent with the ascendance of extremist Sunni groups buoyed by the Afghan jihad. Ethnic violence has affected parts of Balochistan and Karachi. Generally speaking, it has political underpinnings and also outside encouragement. The jihadi groups are a much larger phenomena. They had access to financial resources from the Gulf and had benefited from Western aid meant to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. An important dimension of the phenomena was the mushroom growth of madrasas, mainly of Deobandi creed, which is closer to Wahhabism. Apart from millions of Pakistani students from poorer sections of the society, hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugee children received education in madrasas and became the foot soldiers for the Afghan Jihad and then part of the Afghan Taliban movement. By 1990s, the Afghan Jihad had morphed into civil war, which continues to ravage the country until today. Pakistan viewed the Afghan Taliban as part of the Afghanistan's political landscape. In early 2002, Pakistan pleaded for their inclusion in the Bonn process, but they were lumped together with Al-Qaeda, which was a political error. In the wake of 9/11, Pakistan targeted Al-Qaeda as part of the war on terror, but it made no such commitment with regard to the Afghan Taliban. Distinct from the Afghan Taliban are the Pakistani Taliban, who largely grew in the aftermath of 9/11. Administrative and power structures in the Fata region, tribal regions of Pakistan, had already been disrupted by the Afghan Jihad with the rise of religious clerics. 9/11 and the US intervention pushed into Pakistan not only the Afghan Taliban, but also elements of Al-Qaeda and militants of every stripe who had found safe haven in Afghanistan under the Taliban, including Arabs, Uzbeks, Chechens, and members of ETIM. They joined hands with local dissident tribals who were riled up by the induction of Pakistan army in the region, which was done to target Al-Qaeda, to pursue Al-Qaeda. They killed scores of local tribal maliks and targeted the army itself when it tried to intervene. Lal Masjid incident precipitated the shaping of the TTP. Swat and several other tribal agencies were infected by militancy. It posed a huge challenge to the government and Pakistan army. Operations in South and North Waziristan and Swat spread over almost 8 years, in addition to tens of thousands of civilian casualties. More than 5,000 soldiers lost their lives. During these operations, Pakistan side repeatedly asked the ISAF to help interdict the fleeing militants, but we were disappointed. Today, most of these elements have coalesced under the banner of ISIS inside Afghanistan and are responsible for violent acts in both Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, Kashmir-related groups. Early 1990s witnessed a wave of protests and an uprising in Kashmir, a phenomena that erupts intermittently and is an evidence of Kashmiri alienation. This prompted the formation of Lashkar-e-Taiba and much later Jaish-e-Mohammed. Their agenda was centered on Kashmir. The two groups were banned after the attack on the Indian Parliament, but they regrouped as charity organizations following Musharraf's ceasefire initiative in 2003 and an effort to prevent militants from carrying out activities across the LOC. Many gravitated to Fata to join the militants there. The Mumbai attacks are not ascribed to any Pakistani government policy and are generally linked to Pakistan-based non-state actors. Mumbai was used by India to embarrass Pakistan internationally, and the attacks greatly damaged prospects of a reasonable settlement of Kashmir. Jacob had just mentioned about the back channel. I was part of the back channel, and I know that how Mumbai affected later on these efforts. It moved terrorism onto the center stage of any dialogue between Pakistan and India. The 2009 Sharm el-Sheikh and 2015 UFA joint declarations are a case in point. In short, Mumbai attacks hurt Pakistan's interests. Therefore, Pakistan cannot conceivably think of benefiting from leveraging non-state actors to advance its policy on Kashmir. Since Mumbai, the only incidents of some note are Pathankot and Uri in 2016, which could well be on account of local reaction. Kashmir has been experiencing agitation and protests, which is being suppressed with a strong hand by the Indian security forces. While India accuses Pakistan of abetting violent activities in Kashmir through non-state actors, Pakistan believes, with evidence to support, that India aids subversive activities inside Pakistan, especially in Balochistan and FATA. Now I come to the question of whether counter-terrorism cooperation between Pakistan and India is possible, and would it be helpful?
A couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes, yeah. The dynamic of violent militancy in the region is complex, involves political issues, and extends beyond the purview of any possible Pakistan-India cooperation. Of course, within that larger context, such cooperation can be helpful. To illustrate the point, take Afghanistan. Peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan remain elusive, even though there are positive developments. The US has finally come around to reaching out to the Afghan Taliban. Pakistan is serious in efforts to persuade them to engage in a peace process, but Pakistan has limitations. We cannot be blamed for the continuation of the conflict there. If violence intensifies, naturally Pakistan will suffer the fallout. In this dynamics, Pakistan-India cooperation is a minor factor, even if it helps to assuage Pakistani concerns regarding Indian subversion. Take Kashmir. As long as the issue remains unresolved and Kashmiri agitation continues to occur, there is potential for violent militancy which can agitate, blame game, and negate any prospect of cooperation. Efforts aimed at counter-terrorism cooperation have been tentative and bedeviled by distrust. There have been crises in bilateral relations in the past which have pushed the countries even to conflicts. Yet the two countries have also shown capacity to pull back. There is need to institute arrangements to arrest situations reaching a crisis point. Counter-terrorism cooperation can be part of such arrangements. The key is communication and contact at civil and military leadership level. To cite an example, and I think Jacob also mentioned this thing, when tension had risen on account of Pathankot earlier in 2016, and diplomatic dialogue was suspended, the Pakistani National Security Advisor took the initiative to alert his Indian counterpart about a possible terrorist infiltration. The Indian side acted on the information. The media indulged in considerable negative speculation about Pakistani motives at that time, but it did not detract from the importance of these steps. Such cooperation is both necessary and can help build trust. Similarly, why can't there be regular summits between the two countries, regardless of the state of their relations or high-level military and intelligence contacts? I am not advocating friendship between the two countries, as such advocacy will be judged as naive in today's environment in the region. But beginnings can be made. Kartarpur corridor is one example, cooling off of LOC, resumption of SAARC summit, which is scheduled to take place in Islamabad, and relaxation in exchanges. These can be other steps, small steps. The two neighbors are now far too dangerous for each other to ignore the need for communication and some understanding to avoid crises spiraling out of control. Even during the height of the Cold War, United States and the Soviet Union never severed contacts and dialogue, and I think Pakistan and India have a lesson to learn from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Khan.
Okay, thank you. Moeed has already given me my 5-minute warning, and I have not even started to speak yet, but I will be brief. We
Want to make sure the audience
leave time for questions, exactly. So I want to take the question of what are the lessons learned and just switch it around and use a phrase that I use with my children, which is, did they learn their lesson, right? Did they learn their lesson? It sounds very different than lessons learned. And if you want to see if someone learned their lesson or if a state learned their lesson, you look at behavior, right? You don't look at anything else. And so I think that when it comes to behavior with India and Pakistan, and to a certain extent the United States, a lot of the behavior has remained consistent. It hasn't changed. So what I'd like to do is instead focus on the realizations that were made in the aftermath of Mumbai and look specifically at the American perspectives on what was learned. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the United States as a mediator, and then I'll save the rest for the discussion. I think the biggest thing that we learned from the Mumbai attacks was that terrorists don't need large weapons or a lot of foot soldiers to have a strategic impact. And they can do something very significant with the use of common technology, with surveillance that's readily available to everyone, the use of Google Maps, satellite imagery, that sort of thing, and that and they can actually hold hostage a weak bilateral relationship, which is already weak independently of any kind of attack, and then that in turn affects the interests of the United States in a very big way. In the case of Mumbai, the question on American policymakers' minds, and in the case of a lot of the other instances of conflict, is this something that will escalate? Because both countries have nuclear weapons. That's always kind of in the background. And in Mumbai, I think, brought it home that it's not just a conflict between the state that's going to lead to this escalation. We now have to think about non-state actors in a different way. We have to think about non-state actors that we haven't been focusing on at all, really, right? At the time of the attacks, the U.S. was very much focused on Al-Qaeda, on large terrorist organizations, on leaders of terrorist organizations, and LET was perceived as a regional threat, but very much kind of India-focused. It wasn't really looked at as an organization that would threaten the United States directly or indirectly. And in this case, I think it was an indirect focus and impact on U.S. interests. Now, the question is, did that actually lead to any new strategy or approach towards LET on the part of the U.S. government? I don't think so. I do think that it gave the U.S. a new justification for viewing LET through a broader global lens, but it was really LET's activities in Afghanistan that caused the U.S. to look at it differently as something that was a much more global threat than they had anticipated. But that was something that that was a realization that came up after the Mumbai attacks. On the more technical side, I do think that Mumbai taught us, as U.S. government and also analysts and kind of the think tank community, about the limitations of signals intelligence and cyber surveillance. A lot of the information in the signals intelligence, which would have kind of allowed us to prevent the Mumbai attacks, was out there. Some of it was out there, it was shared, but there wasn't the analysis that was needed to actually put things together, and that's a resources issue. And so I think one of the lessons learned is also that a much more significant amount of resources are required if we are actually going to do crisis prevention of this kind, and it will require a lot more multilateral dialogue and collaboration, not just between India and Pakistan, but also the United States and the UK and any other country that's kind of involved in this space and has information to share. And there really isn't a framework or a structure. There's no infrastructure for kind of having those conversations. A lot of that depends on the strength of specific bilateral relationships. So I just wanted to make note of that. And finally, the whole issue of domestic radicalization, I think, really came to mind after Mumbai. Eventually, when David Headley came into the picture and we were looking at kind of how this whole thing was allowed to happen and the extent of this operation, it really caused a lot of us to think about the impact that just one or two people can have, and through the support of private networks that will facilitate and finance terrorist activity. Okay, so that's on the lessons learned part. I think in looking at really briefly on how the countries can work jointly together or separately, we should just distinguish between crisis prevention and crisis management. I think crisis management is something that countries do when an attack happens and there's a need that needs to be met, and there's a lot of political pressure to react. In those instances, I think India and Pakistan and the United States do as best as can be expected with each other. There's a lot of pressure to react. There's even more so if there are non-Indian, non-Pakistani citizens involved. That was the case with Mumbai. So the expectation of India-Pakistan collaboration and cooperation goes up from the international community, but there's also, conversely at home, there's pressure to kind of protect interests. And when you have nationalist governments, it's also going to be harder to make those decisions to cooperate. And then I would just, I'm not going to get into them now, but I would just remind everyone to think about all that goes into kind of joint collaboration when there is a crisis. There's emergency response, but there's also the diplomatic engagement, there's law enforcement, the justice and courts angle, which comes afterwards. Then there's the intelligence sharing, which we talked about. India and Pakistan are not built to work together on all of these. I think there are some that are going to be easier to do, like the emergency response, but on the justice and courts, law enforcement, that's a lot more challenging. I think intelligence is actually a space that is, there's some opportunity there, and with the US getting involved. And we saw that after Mumbai, that there was information shared, and the US played as positive as could, a role as it could have played. And then I would also just put the idea out there that do India and Pakistan need to cooperate with each other on prevention? Can they exist independently, right? And just putting it out there is something we talked about before this event started. And if you look at Mumbai, on the response side, a lot of the failures were actually in India, right? The cause of it was related to Pakistan, but intelligence failure, CT training, the responsiveness of the commandos, flawed hostage rescue plans, these are all internal Indian kind of security apparatus dynamics that could be and have been worked on since Mumbai that don't require any Pakistani collaboration. So I just want to put that out there. We always jump to the conclusion that India and Pakistan should work together on X, Y, and Z without thinking through, can they work apart? And then finally, just on the U.S. side, I think that the U.S. has always played a role in India-Pakistan conflict when it emerges. It tends to work more effectively if it's private and if it's back channel. Unfortunately, it happens most when there's fear of escalation. There's not a kind of a regular kind of interlocutor role for the United States, and that's because because India and Pakistan have different views of what that role should be. And every new administration in the United States, with the exception of this one, I think, has come in thinking, oh, well, we'll help solve Kashmir. Right? And historically, the Pakistani policy towards that has been, yes, let's have the U.S. facilitate that. The Indians don't want that. This administration hasn't gotten into that, but it doesn't work because not everyone actually wants, not everyone wants these three countries at the table, right? And I think that the bureaucracy in the United States government eventually, wins on that kind of view that we should not get involved in these bilateral issues. But then when you have a situation like Mumbai, you have crises that are manufactured by non-state actors, it actually forces the two countries to be connected again, right? So any attempt to dehyphenate the policy is ultimately a failure because of these kind of security conflicts that can't be resolved, and that the U.S. actually, we could get involved, but there's not really space for us to do so. I would just also say that any sustained pressure that the United States is going to utilize when it comes to South Asia will be focused more on Afghanistan and the war and any kind of militancy or security issues related to that over anything related to India, Pakistan. The U.S. has been consistent in that kind of focus, and that's just because of where the interests are. Should the U.S. pull out all of its troops of Afghanistan, I think then you have a very different situation. At the same time, there is a community of experts that's focused on India-Pakistan relations. They're focused on the nuclear question, the fact that a lot of these groups that are anti-India are in Punjab. So, I wouldn't discount that there's an interest or focus, but we always have to remember kind of how the policy is defined right now and what are the other competing priorities. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, and thanks for sticking to your time. Steve?
Thank you, Moeed. I'm going to be as quick as I can be. Let me start. If I sort of had an overall thematic for this, it would be that I think terrorism actually in the future will look similar to what it looked like before Mumbai. Not the same, but similar, but crisis management will look somewhat different. And I'll unpack that now. First point is that I know we're not here to talk about history, but I think it's important to recognize and understand that Mumbai was in many ways an aberration when it comes to Lashkar-e-Taiba attacks in Pakistan. And I want to be specific, LET attacks that involve Pakistanis infiltrating into Indian territory outside of Indian-administered Kashmir to execute attacks versus LAT supporting Indians for bombings or tasking them for things of that nature. It was a much bigger operational success than the leaders of the organization probably planned for. That was in part due to the fact that initially they wanted the 10 men to try to exfiltrate themselves and escape. They made a determination late in the game to move to a martyrdom operation, which meant everybody was going to fight to the death, which meant that the attacks went on until everybody was killed. And the Indian response was really bad, and so this took over 60 hours. Also, when you move to a martyrdom operation and you're no longer going to escape, you don't need to go to the train station to escape anymore, and the train station becomes a target, which is where a plurality, if not a majority, of the killings occurred. So I think it's important to understand that operationally Mumbai looks very different. It's also important to understand that Mumbai happens at a time when Pakistan is beginning to face a really, really large insurgency that it has now largely sort of got a handle on, but it is a time when a group like Lashkar-e-Taiba was facing defections, not just of foot soldiers, but of mid-ranking individuals, which puts pressure on the organization to do something much bigger than it has ever done before. Those conditions on the ground in Pakistan look very different today than they did then. So I think when we're talking about this, it's important to understand that in many ways, the terrorist attacks that we've seen since Mumbai, like Pathankot, and look similar to the ones that we saw beforehand, right? Far less spectacular, not as lethal. That doesn't mean that they're not problematic, but things look different. That's number one. Number two, as I alluded to, Pakistan has gotten a handle on its insurgency. India has also made, I would argue, progress. And this is my second point. Both countries are, if they have not won, are at least winning their own wars on terror. And what do I mean by that? Well, on the Pakistani side, the TTP has been severely degraded and pushed across the border. That doesn't mean that it's no longer a threat. There are still attacks, but it is not at the height of the insurgency like it was a couple years ago. Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent has never really caught fire, and IS Khorasan province is still primarily, although not exclusively, focused on Afghanistan. And just as an aside, would probably face some pressure from its Saudi donors not to really ramp things up in Pakistan, even if it wanted to. LET is back to being active in Indian-administered Kashmir, where I agree, I don't think everything that LET does in Indian-administered Kashmir is necessarily directed by the ISI. It is still active in Afghanistan. It has got a much bigger seat at the table domestically in Pakistan than it has in the past, which means that it's got more to lose than it has in the past. And it has always, and I want to stress this, always I think, towed the military ISI line when it comes to attacks in India outside of Indian-administered Kashmir. And I have not seen any evidence of Lashkar-e-Taiba ever doing an attack in India that outside of Indian administered Kashmir that it did not believe was sanctioned, and that includes the Mumbai attacks where a number of its handlers were involved. Which doesn't mean that it couldn't, but I've not seen evidence of that. Jaish-e-Mohammed is a different story. I've seen evidence of the ISI and LET trying to use Jaish-e-Mohammed as a sort of cat's paw, right, for the Lashkar-e-Taiba. That comes from Indian officials, primarily in Indian administered Kashmir, but also outside of it. Which takes us to India. Yes, things are worse in Indian administered Kashmir than they've been in recent years. Some of that is domestic, some of that is imported. It is nowhere near what things looked like, 18 or 15 years ago. The Indian Mujahideen, which was a domestic jihadist organization that was nurtured and supported by Lashkar and by the ISI, has been severely degraded. That was the other big threat that India was facing from around 2005 or 6 through about 2010 or 11. That has been seriously degraded. Which leaves us with these sort of, every couple of years, LET and or JEM attacks. We might be looking at the calm before the storm. We might see another big Mumbai. LET may spin out of control, but there's no indications as of today that that's going to happen. Jaish-e-Mohammed is, I think, more of a wild card. And if I think that the ISI is playing with fire with LET, I think they're playing with fire even more with JEM when it comes to India. Which brings me to my third point, which is what happens if things do spin out of control and there is another really big attack, and why do I think crisis management will look a little bit different. First, let me say that I agree with Shamila's point that I think crisis prevention is very, very difficult for a lot of reasons. If for no other reason than it requires sharing of intelligence, which is something that is going to be very, very difficult for the Indians and Pakistanis to do, on a really, big basis. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't necessarily collaborate to try to head off a big attack if that big attack wasn't sanctioned. But that's different than sort of ongoing intelligence sharing. On the one hand, a lot of the structural impediments to a aggressive Indian response are still in place. The reasons why India did not attack Pakistan after 2008, why it did not attack Pakistan after 2001 parliament attack are still there, right? India has a lot to lose in this. At the same time, some things look different. One is the fact that I think the U.S. as a broker doesn't necessarily have the same credibility it has in the past. Two is that, twice now, Pakistan has sort of said, we're going to get this under control, we're going to rein it back in, and has taken steps that were largely cosmetic. Banning both groups in 2002, LET and JEM, only to see them reemerge under new names. Putting 7 people on trial after Mumbai. Now all of them are out on the street. And Jamaat-e-Dawa continues to operate. That is the above-ground organization for LET. LET continues to operate as well. And then I think the final wild card is the leaders. Would Modi stay his hand? I don't know that he would. What would Imran Khan look like, as a Pakistani, leader in this type of situation? I'm not sure that we can say. And then finally, I am sorry to raise his name here. I know we've gotten through an entire panel without talking about Donald Trump, but I don't know that any of us know, whether Donald Trump is going to be a voice for calm or whether he's going to tweet out India should attack tomorrow, thus creating more pressure on New Delhi to take action. We just don't know. That's a wild card. And I've been, privy to enough conversations, where the question is asked, should the United States be trying to stay India's hand and keep it from attacking Pakistan, or should it be trying to sort of influence what a counterattack would look like, because it believes that the time has come where Pakistan is punished for its actions? That debate probably becomes operative again the minute there's a really large attack. And again, we just don't know what this administration is going to say, whether it's going to try to, throw water on the fire or gasoline. So I'll leave it there.
Sure.
Just add
you.
one. Thank you for bringing that. One thing I forgot to say is that that level of, or that the role that the United States has played as a mediator and being trusted has been diminishing for a while now, right? So before Trump, it was also the case that the U.S. was seen as not as honest or had competing interests, and we knew that, and part of the kind of interest in getting China to be more involved in certain security issues was to facilitate that, these conversations, then we would be able to look to China. I wouldn't underestimate the role that the UK has played historically in these conflicts and would probably play in future conflicts, especially given the China-India relationship. I don't see the Chinese stepping in on behalf of Pakistan or as an honest broker, right? So there would be, we might want to focus on the UK. And then the second thing on CBMs, if you don't have CBMs and you don't have a dialogue when there is a conflict, there's nothing to put on hold, right? And a lot of these governments, they actually, if they're weak or if they're nationalist, like they need something to show the public that, okay, this bad thing happened and now we're going to cut off this CBM essentially, which does nothing, which has no real impact or negative impact. And then you can start it up again, right? Yeah. But if you have nothing, then you really have there's no political space for leaders and bureaucracies to negotiate an outcome.
Can I just, I think, look, going from your last point to sort of your first point, that Mumbai was the death knell at the time for a really fragile peace process, but you had a peace process that you could end if you were India, and you don't really have that now, right? So you don't have that important political diplomatic step that you can take. I think that's number one. The other point that I wanted to respond to, or 2 points, was that I think China has played a role in the past, including in 2001, trying to step in and pull Pakistan back, because it doesn't want to see instability in the region. And I don't think it's an honest broker, but I do think it is an invested broker in Pakistan in the way that it hasn't been previously. And so maybe sort of trying to rein it in. And I think that becomes more important. I think your point about the UK is accurate as well. The third is just that, I mentioned that idea of, does the United States try to keep India from responding or influence its response? And there's two reasons for having that debate, right? One is the question of whether it's necessary for India to respond in order to ultimately change Pakistan's behavior. And then the other is whether India is going to respond regardless of what the United States says at this point. And so you should try to shape that response rather than blowing your credibility by keeping it from responding. But all of this is probably going to happen even faster than it did in 2008 or in 2001. And it's going to happen really, really fast at a time when I'm just not sure that the U.S. government in its current form, I think you're right, Shamila. I think there's a lot of people that are focused on this. But right at the top, I'm just not sure where the key players are how that's going to work in what we need to be a really speedy crisis management scenario, where they're going to have to make that decision really quickly. Are we going to try to shape? Are we going to try to restrain? And again, you have somebody who may just sort of be like, forget it, they should just go for it, right? And then what do you do?
I agree.
Thanks. On that optimistic note. So let me open it up just by saying that I'll just point to two things. One, I wouldn't underestimate the word nuclear in all of this in terms of the US policy thinking. And one of the things I found in my book is just how obsessed people get with that. And that's actually a good thing, because it then drives this behavior of rationality. The other thing is, at least in my work, I found the one thing that I discounted to a large extent is honesty and trust. What really drove India and Pakistan to work with the US in crises was, one, they have no bilateral options, good options. And second, it was the perceived influence that the US had over your opponent. If India and Pakistan believed that if the US really wanted, it could get them what they're looking for, they would engage. And I think China doesn't come close in that space for various reasons. But let me open it up and see if we have questions. I have a couple, but I'll hold off so that others have a chance. Or I could start if nobody has one. Okay, let me sort of go to the panel, and if you do, please raise your hand, and I'll stop and come back to you. So the first question is perhaps for the panel, and if I could get a quick response, is the same question I asked Happy Mon. I've sort of dug into this as deep as I can for my own work. And the more I dig into this, the more I realize that basically, I think at some point the Pakistani sort of mind transitioned from gaming this to becoming petrified of the consequences of this going wrong internally, whether it's LET or it's other groups. And so the struggle then is when the question of sanction comes up, or the question of proxy comes up, for instance, what does that mean? Does that still mean the 90s? Does it mean that the top and the remaining layers of the system are not in sync? I mean, I can give you my conclusion on Mumbai, but that's besides the point. Where is this? I'm asking because if, from a crisis management perspective, if India's default position is everything that happens is the Pakistani state that's doing it, and if in a case of a crisis trigger that's not true, then you've got a very odd situation where both India and Pakistan genuinely feel that they're not responsible for what's coming at them. India wants to do something because of what you're saying. Pakistan feels we have evidence, we had nothing to do with this. We're also, and then that escalatory ladder becomes much more likely because you've got two, self-aggrieved parties, if you will, in that context. So maybe, Riyasat, you want to begin and others can respond.
Okay. I think one question that one needs to ask is, what is it that Pakistan was aiming to gain if there was some kind of an official sanction behind, say, attack on the parliament or Mumbai? What is it? What is the possible objective? Now, if the question is that of derailing the peace process, my God, derailing the peace process is so easy. Within the bureaucracy of the Foreign Office and the military and others, they just have to agree that it doesn't suit us, we don't want to go ahead. You don't have to do a Mumbai, or you don't have to do the attack on the parliament to derail that process. What else could be the objective? The objective is to get Kashmir. You don't get Kashmir by attacking Mumbai. So the thing is that this question must be asked when, the question of mistrust that you have raised, and the Indians, that there is always some scheming people in the ISI or somewhere else that are behind it. So the question is that of the objective. Now, if you remember, after the parliament attack, the Twin Peak crisis which took place, yes, it was United States which also intervened at one point of time. There were diplomatic envoys who went to Delhi and Islamabad. But one thing which also need to be taken into account is that all along, right from the day one, once the armies were in that eyeball-to-eyeball situation, the Indians moved their troops to the border, and Pakistan had to also do the same. But after, what was Pakistan's position? Pakistan had been saying de-escalation, 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 dialogue. Talk to us, what is your problem? So why Pakistan should have done a thing which would have raised the escalation when it is basically asking for de-escalation right after that? So that is why I think these things, this is very important as to whether this whole question of proxy, which somehow the other is linked to the past of the 90s and the 80s. In the 80s, the proxies were used in Afghanistan. And it was not just by Pakistan that the proxies were used. By the half of the world had used those proxies. So similarly, later on, we did think that probably these non-state actors can be helpful. That was early 90s, but afterwards, there is no conceivable interest which is served by using non-state actors.
I take your point that it wouldn't make sense, the Pakistani state would sanction this. It doesn't benefit them at all in the long run. But I would argue that there are competing interests within the state. And there's also, there are a variety of power imbalances which suggest that parts of the state might have an interest in supporting certain groups' agendas, perhaps not tactically supporting them, but in spirit they may have mutual or shared interests, which leads me to my main point, which is I think that the word proxy is kind of a Cold War model. I think we're thinking about, when we think proxy, it makes me think we're in this old mode of thinking, and we really just have to think of non-state actors, and of which the state has a relationship with, and often that relationship is defined by action and inaction. And because the Pakistani state has not acted on certain things with regards to these groups, that I think that's one way to kind of explain that. So these are conditions which enable this kind of activity, and the facilitation of space, or the availability of physical space, so safe havens, and then there's this shared interest question. So you may not have a shared, these groups may not have a shared interest with the state writ large, but they may have a shared interest with, say, a segment of the intelligence apparatus, which has,
So rogue kind of man? Okay.
I'm not saying rogue, but anyway, they're just, let's leave it at shared interest.
Okay.
Can I? Yeah,
I'll come back to you.
I'll be as quick as I can. Just first, to pick up on Shmuel's point about sort of the fact that the state is not a uniform entity, I don't think anybody's talking about the civilian government wanting to do a Mumbai. I think we're talking about the military and the ISI supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba. And I agree that, the term proxy is not a great term. I don't like it. It suggests a level of control that I don't think is reflected in reality. But I think it's hard to argue that Lashkar-e-Taiba is a state-supported organization. It's a state-allied organization. Right. It continues to receive active support from the Pakistani security establishment by any definition of the term active support. There is provision of sanctuary and safe haven. There is, almost certainly sharing of information and intelligence. There's organizational support. We know that in Mumbai there was operational support for the attacks from the ISI. David Headley has named the ISI handlers who were involved, including one individual who chose one of the targets. Okay, so the idea that the ISI wasn't involved with that is, I think, we should just, there's an overabundance of empirical evidence to suggest that that there was support, and there's no evidence to suggest that support doesn't continue. The question then becomes whether the ISI leadership was aware or not, whether the military leadership was aware or not. And I had a column yesterday in the War on the Rocks where I was I don't know. We still don't know. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that the way that Pakistan has sort of set this game up at this point is, if the leaders were aware, then the military and the ISI, and therefore Pakistan, because the military and the ISI controls foreign security policy, are culpable. And if they weren't aware, then they've set up a situation in which this group is allowed to continue to exist, is allowed to continue to get operational support from lower levels within the military and the ISI, and not done anything about it. In which case, from an Indian perspective, you can argue they are also culpable. As for the Mumbai attacks, there's plenty of empirical evidence to suggest that they had multiple purposes. One was to derail the fragile peace process. A second was to shore up Lashkar-e-Taiba. We have David Headley in an interrogation saying that one of the reasons why the ISI supported an attack of this nature was because they wanted to make sure that LET had sort of solid jihadist credibility at a time when the anti-state jihadist insurgency was growing. I think that, to me, is how we need to look at this relationship. It is complex, but unfortunately, in 2018, at this stage, when LET continues to exist in Pakistan, it's hard to argue that that Pakistan still has earned itself the benefit of the doubt.
And the further risk associated with this is the mainstreaming of certain Islamist groups into political life in Pakistan, as we saw last year.
I think, all of this is fair. The question, I think, remains, it's a very important question for crisis management, which is, reality is less important than perceptions. If both sides feel objectively that what is being put on them is not correct, then crisis management becomes much more likely. Then if you feel one party, you're guilty and you want to hide behind something. And that's the question. So in my work, I've written a lot about a failure of imagination. We are focused on what happened in the past as happening again. It could be an ISIS Al-Qaeda attack tomorrow, in which case neither side would actually have a role in that, but ISIS and Al-Qaeda would do it precisely to create a situation where they feel they need to escalate. We are seeing, I mean, one thing I disagree with you on, Steve, is you say that counterterrorism is better, yes, at a time when intolerance is growing in both societies.
Yes, but those are two different things.
Well, I don't know if they are, because if that's the fundamental sort of pipeline through which some of this comes, I actually think things could go horribly wrong, because the number of people who are potentially there to be used is much greater. So I think there's a bit of a contradiction in what is happening in societies, what we're seeing in India, what we're seeing, and the counterterrorism, which to me is tactical. Ultimately preventing it. But let me first...
Can I just make a two-finger...
Let me get a question from the audience, and then you can answer this too. Yeah.
Yeah, so because of this question about sort of the mainstreaming issue, and thank you all for your comments so far. My question is, so on the one side, if Pakistanis were to try to mainstream LT, right, I don't see any scenario in which the sort of Western international community is necessarily happy about LT becoming political actors. The reverse is true. There's no scenario in which the international community wants it to continue to be terrorists. So the question is then, what do we do? How do we address that catch-22? Because, despite all the different issues that come up in the bilateral relation, that is the central issue, is the LT. In my opinion, it's even bigger than Kashmir by itself. I know Kashmir territorially is most important, but this central issue of LT and its role in the region is something that we just haven't been able to get past. And part of it is because of Mumbai, but that's not the only reason.
Can I jump in on that and then also respond to your other point? Sure. So I agree with you. It's really difficult. And from a U.S. perspective, the United States could never sort of endorse the idea of Lashkar-e-Taiba becoming a proper political actor because of the message that I think that would send globally, right, in terms of terrorism. And at the same time, what the United States could do sort of officially versus tacitly are two different things. And I think, right, you could see a scenario where the United States publicly is not thrilled with this, but privately is willing to sort of encourage and facilitate it. The problem is LET is already becoming a mainstream political actor, but without having to give up terrorism. All right? I had a conversation with a high-ranking Pakistani official a couple years ago. I always use this anecdote, and he was like, isn't it better that these guys are in politics than involved in terrorism? And my response was, yes, but you don't force them to choose. So I think that's one. Just very quickly to your point, Moeed, and Ambassador, you said earlier that you think that, right, the wider jihadist movement is weakening. And so I think it's important to differentiate the state of organizations from the state of a movement. I think you are correct, sir, that globally, jihadist organizations are weaker, but I think the movement is stronger. And Moeed, I would suggest that in both India and Pakistan, terrorist organizations are weaker, but the extremist ideologies behind them are stronger. And I think we're seeing a rise in religious violence, but that is not necessarily the same as state-supported terrorism or terrorist organizations that have the capability to launch international attacks.
Sure, but the pool is growing. The pool of potential people you can borrow from is growing.
Not sure the pool was ever the issue.
Yeah. I think first, this point about the ISI and some people that the institutions may not be on the same page. I have some experience of the government in Pakistan. And I can tell you that if the ISI or the military leadership doesn't want something, then it can prevail. And it is not just in Pakistan. Take, for example, this question of Siachen. On Siachen, the foreign offices of the two countries, they came very close to a formula. But it was and it has been written by Shyam Saran, but it was the army and the security, they said no. And they did not even give a reason. They just said that Pakistanis cannot be trusted. And there was no reason to argue that way. Nonetheless, it didn't go forward. Similarly, in Pakistan, if the army did not want or the ISI did not want that the peace process should move further, they just had to say that, look, this is not the time. And that would have been enough. Not that they had to do the Mumbai or something else to install it. So my point is that as far as rogue elements are concerned, rogue elements are everywhere in the world. We don't take responsibility for that. But as far as the government policies are concerned and the government institutions are concerned, where the leadership of those institutions are involved with decision making, there I don't think that there is a sentiment that we should be using proxies for these kinds of actions. Now, this question about extremism, extremist violence. I made a general point that it is the militancy is on the decline. I think you may be right that there are spots where these people adhere to those ideologies, that extremist ideology still lives. But within those societies, within Pakistan, I see a change, that there is a certain rejection of these violent actions. So that is going to make a difference. And as far as LET is concerned, LET, there may be some people who may say that, look, Kashmir is very close to our heart and we will lay down our lives, etc., all that. But would they be encouraged to go inside Kashmir to commit violent actions? I don't think that any government, within the government sort of institutions, there would be any support for that kind of policy, because we have experience and we have seen that in 1990s it did not work. So that is why I would say that we should keep this distinction. As far as crisis management is concerned, the most important thing is that both the countries, by virtue of being nuclear powers, they have to have a certain modicum of communication with each other. And that is why I am a very strong supporter that there ought to be, at least in 3 years, once a summit level meeting, because those meetings, they cool down temperatures. And then I see that there is no reason why the intelligence and the military leadership should not also have contacts of some sorts. And I was very happy that the national security advisors, they had some bonhomie with each other at one point of time.
Thank you. If not anything else, I promised a provocative conversation. I think we've achieved that. I want to thank the speakers and Apimon, who of course is not here. Let me just end by saying that I think one of my big frustrations in this work is that so much of the time goes into proving the unprovable, if you will. At the end of the day, I find for crisis management, perceptions being much more important than reality. And I at least would submit that perceptions on both India and Pakistan sides are actually far more negative than they were 10 years ago. So if you get into a situation, I mean, we remember the crises. We remember 2001, 2002. We remember Mumbai. What we don't remember is the number of times crises could have occurred, but India and Pakistan chose not to create a crisis. Those are equally important data points. And there were incidents of terrorism in the early 2000s where India basically didn't respond. In 2007, there was the attack on the Samjhauta train express, which killed I don't know how many Pakistani citizens. 50 plus Pakistanis. Pakistan chose not to create a crisis. We always remember the Big Bang, but there have been episodes where there's been a decision not to escalate. And I think if I were to sum up everything I've heard here, I think that decision has become much more difficult politically on both sides. One side feels that they've done certain things which are not recognized. The other side feels, I don't care if something hits me, I'm the victim and I can respond. And that's, I think, the problem that we have to grapple with going forward. Thank you very much for joining us, and please join me in thanking the panelists.